What's going on, everyone? I'm back, and today we are going to look at the zero running back draft strategy for this 2018 fantasy football season. I've got a couple of drafts in the books already. We're going to take a look at the results. We're going to talk which pick in the first round precipitates the best result for this type of strategy, and then overall whether it's a valid strategy or not to go for PPR versus standard formats as well, and then also compare what kind of roster we put together using this strategy and then what it would have looked like if we drafted without this strategy as well. So let's get right into it. Looking at this first example, as you can see, it's a 12-team PPR through fantasy football calculator, and switch things up a little bit in terms of the formats that we're using in order to get a different sense on these ADPs and where certain players are going. But enough of that. The more important thing here is we've got the 4th pick overall, and the reason I made that decision is because I wanted to put myself in a situation, no matter the format, to go ahead and select the best wide receiver hands down, and that is without a doubt Antonio Brown. And that's exactly what we see. Antonio Brown with the first pick, followed by, surprisingly to me at least, Keenan Allen being still available at the end of the second round to me. So immediately I have Antonio Brown, Keenan Allen, great 1-2 punch at the wide receiver position, especially in PPR, so an added boost. Then going back to my selection in the third round, adding to the flex position with another pass catcher in Josh Gordon. I like his potential as far as high touchdown percentage, red zone target, just has to stay on the field. The only risk there is with that category. And then in the 4th round, adding another pass catcher, this time with Zach Ertz. So he will be used as my tight end, maybe a little bit of a reach, but still finalizing out those starting pass catchers on the roster. And then we see this slew of running backs being selected on my end as if my life depended on it, because that's what's going to have to happen in order to make up for the guys that weren't selected in the first couple of rounds since we went wide receiver heavy. And you see the selections, here's the names. Royce Freeman, Marlon Mack in the 6th, Aaron Jones in the 7th, Nick Chubb in the 9th. And basically, even though these guys might be highlighted on your big board like they are on mine, the difference here is we see them as potential breakout candidates, but it's one thing to have them as potential breakout candidates and lock them in as your running back number 1 or running back number 2, as I have for Marlon Mack, whereas doing that and locking them in as your flex player or as your potential breakout bench player is something completely different, which you're going to see in this next example that I have here. And I think this is pretty interesting, where I have included, a little bit more cleaned up version of what this roster looks like. On the left, you've got the zero running back strategy roster and your typical quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, flex, and then bench players. And also next to each name, I have got the round where they were selected. So, like I said, the zero running back strategy roster is the one that we just went over. But more interestingly, I want to focus on the best value roster, because I treated that best value roster at the same position, but instead of going pure zero running back strategy, going best player available, and then dissecting which roster is better. And with my first selection, we already have a difference, because instead of taking Antonio Brown, I went with Ezekiel Elliott because of the potential I like with him in the red zone. He can also catch passes, get close to, I don't know how close it'll be to 1,000 yards receiving, but it'll definitely be over 1,000 yards rushing. And then in the 2nd round, keeping that Keenan Allen selection, really like the value I got for him. And then this is where the bunch of differences start. Darius Geis in the 3rd instead of Josh Gordon at a flex. I get a running back 2 instead of a flex player, which I think is more valuable. Then in the 4th round, I get a wide receiver 2 instead of a tight end, which I think is more valuable with Juju Smith. 5th round, I fill out that flex spot with Jarvis Landry. I really like his potential in PPR leagues. And then another big difference here that I alluded to with Marlon Mack. Now I have him coming off my bench if I need to with the 6th round. Still got him in the same round, but the only difference is instead of relying him on as a running back number 2, now I can have him on my bench and include him when he does hit his stride. Obviously, the big maybe downfall here is Kyle Rudolph versus Zach Ertz, but I still think Kyle Rudolph will be a great tight end, and I got him in the 7th round. And then pretty much after that, the remaining players are the same. As far as overall grades go, the zero running back strategy roster that I have here, I'd probably give it, a very low C-, because those running backs have me nervous. As much as I like my pass catchers, the tight end position could have been addressed later. Whereas the one on the right, I think, even though it's not ideal either, and it can be improved upon, it's definitely better than the zero running back strategy. It's more balanced. It includes less players that we reached on. So for that, I'd probably give it at least an entire letter grade higher as far as the performance. And now let's continue this look with a second example at the same exact pick location, but instead we will be looking at a 12-team standard format. Now looking at our second example, as you can see, the only difference is the format itself, standard versus PPR. In the standard scenario, still picking Antonio Brown 4th overall. Then the first real difference comes in the 2nd round where we go AJ Green instead of Keenan Allen. In this scenario, Allen actually got picked before AJ Green, which I find very surprising, and I wouldn't do myself since in standard leagues, Keenan Allen's value, every other game he has about 10 receptions, which half point versus full point PPR, that's between 5 and 10 points, whereas AJ Green is a much bigger, more physical wide receiver who will get more red zone looks in my opinion, and I do think that Cincinnati offense will get better this year after addressing their offensive line issues. And even though I harp on the fact that I try and go 2 running backs at least in the first 2 or 2 out of the 3 rounds, it's hard to dislike a collection of Antonio Brown and AJ Green, who I think was very good value again in the 2nd round in a standard format. Ideally, I would have gone running back in the 3rd round, but since we're doing the zero running back strategy, hit the wide receiver position again with Adam Thielen. I thought he was a little bit safer than Josh Gordon, Tyreek Hill, or Stephon Diggs. And then in the 4th round, went with Juju Smith. And this is where we see a problem because doing the zero running back strategy, you're either going to do it for the first 3 or 4 rounds. If you do it for the first 4 rounds, most of us aren't in a scenario where we can play 4 wide receivers in our league formats. Some of us are, but I would say the majority aren't. So that 4th selection, if it is a wide receiver, you're pretty much drafting a bench player. So as much as I like Juju Smith, I added him here for insurance in case Adam Thielen, doesn't have as great of a performance with Kirk Cousins now there, and if Kirk Cousins gets another favorite target, something like that. But after this point, similar to last time, going running back heavy, and you see a lot of the similar names. Royce Freeman in the 5th, 6th round, Tavon Coleman, Marlon Mack got selected a little bit before that. Could have gone Dion Lewis, but I think Tavon Coleman is a better secondary running back. And then going Aaron Jones again. LeGarrette Blount in the 8th round, a little bit of a difference. I do think, depending on how Detroit uses him, I think he has high touchdown potential. So not a horrible pick. I think he can be a flex player. And then the 9th, 10th round, Luck and Jack Doyle as a quarterback tight end combination. But now, more interestingly, let's go back to the best value chart and look at that roster that we were able to put together. And I know this is a little bit hindsight here since we're picking this roster based on knowing who went before and being able to switch things up a little bit. But nonetheless, again, first pick, Ezekiel Elliott. That would be my selection in standard especially. He, to me, as much as I like Antonio Brown, has higher touchdown potential, especially when you get in the red zone. Then in the 2nd round, I went with Michael Thomas instead of AJ Green. And this is where I say hindsight because in the 3rd round, I went with Joe Mixon. And I didn't want to have 2 Cincinnati Bengal players. Obviously, things could have unfolded differently if my selection was actually Michael Thomas. But for the sake of this argument, 2nd round Michael Thomas, 3rd round Joe Mixon is available. I only selected that player if he was selected after my point in that draft, which Joe Mixon was. So immediately, Ezekiel Elliott, Joe Mixon, Michael Thomas versus Antonio Brown, AJ Green, and Adam Thielen. I like the diversity here a little bit better, even though I'll say it's not by much because I really did like the value of an AJ Green. I think where this really sets itself apart is with the 4th pick, where Juju Smith is now a starting wide receiver versus a benched wide receiver. And then from there, my flex player in the 5th round, still Royce Freeman. So again, instead of a running back 1, I get him as a flex player. In the 6th round, I go with Michael Crabtree instead of Tavon Coleman. Crabtree is going to be a starter, whereas Coleman is a backup. You can see the value there. Crabtree has had high touchdown potential his last couple years. I think he will be the best receiver for the Ravens, no matter who the quarterback is there. Then in the 7th round, going with a tight end a little bit earlier in Kyle Rudolph. And then 8th round, again, LeGarrette Blount. 9th round, Andrew Luck. And then 10th round, the only difference is we went with Kenny Stills instead of a tight end. So again, I would say ranking these two rosters in the 0 running back strategy, I'd probably give this roster, again, probably a C-, if not lower, because of the running back situation. Having Tavon Coleman as a starter really makes me nervous. If Royce Freeman really pans out, this gets better. But then on the right side, we see Zeke, we see Joe Mixon, Michael Thomas, Juju Smith, Royce Freeman. We still have him, but as a flex, I think the right roster, the best value roster, is safer. And again, to me, at least 1 grade value point higher than the one on the left with the 0 running back strategy. So now let's transition to the same situation. We'll look at a PPR draft first, but this will be in the latter half of the 1st round. Looking at this next example, you can see same scenario as the previous PPR example. The only difference is we're picking in the latter half of the 1st round, like I said, specifically 9th pick overall. And the purpose here was to see what this would precipitate in terms of wide receiver talent and overall roster talent if we pick towards the start or the end of the 1st round. So immediately going next best available wide receiver, since Antonio Brown won't be available at this point. The pick was Odell Beckham, and to me, it was between ODB and Julio Jones, but I went with Odell since I think the addition of Saquon Barkley will open things up for Odell. And then in the 2nd round, similar to the previous example, Keenan Allen is the selection. The only difference is I picked him 5 picks earlier here, so not quite as good value, but in my opinion, he was still the best wide receiver available. And then in the 3rd round, going with Josh Gordon. So immediately, 2 out of the first 3 picks are the same. Got a little bit better value for Gordon in the 3rd round, a little bit worse value for Keenan Allen in the 2nd, but obviously that's going to, vary from draft to draft and who's picking, how they value certain players. But with this first 3 group of guys, still can't be, too upset. Obviously, the difference is Antonio Brown versus Odell Beckham. But the big distinction here is the fact that in the 4th round, we make that switch from pass catchers to running backs. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But there in the 4th round, we go Kenyon Drake. 5th round, Marlon Mack. Then 6th, Tavon Coleman. 7th, Kirk Cousins. 8th, Jordan Reed. Then Ty Montgomery in the 9th. And Calvin Ridley in the 10th. So now looking at our formatted look at these rosters, 0 running back versus best value again. You see the roster on the left with the 0 running back formatted a little bit better, a little nicer, cleaned up. And on the right, the best value. And let's dissect the best value roster a little bit, because I think that's the one that's a little bit more interesting here. And in the 1st round, instead of going Odell Beckham, I decided to go with Dalvin Cook. And this is a little bit maybe pick that can be debated, because a little bit early to go Dalvin Cook in the 9th selection overall, but in my perspective, I like him more than a Kareem Hunt. Melvin Gordon, Leonard Fournette could have also been selections, but I went with Dalvin Cook since all we're hearing right now is that he's healthy. And if he is 100% healthy, I like him maybe even a little bit more than Melvin Gordon or Leonard Fournette. But moving on from that, in the 2nd round then, going Christian McCaffrey, so going back to that back-to-back running back situation. And I would say a little bit of a reach on Christian McCaffrey this early in the 2nd round, but that's what happens when Melvin Gordon and Leonard Fournette were both selected. Would have loved to have selected Leonard Fournette and pair him up with Dalvin Cook, but he got picked one pick right before me, so unfortunately couldn't make that happen. Instead, we have Dalvin Cook and Christian McCaffrey, and then in the third round, we start hitting the wide receiver position. Again, Josh Gordon is the selection. I like the value there. So instead, now that this is where the difference comes in these two rosters, Josh Gordon as a wide receiver number 1 versus Josh Gordon as a flex player. And then in the fourth round, going Kenyon Drake again. The difference here being he is now a flex player versus a running back number 1. So I guess I would say in order to evaluate these rosters truly, what do you value more? Switching Josh Gordon from a flex to wide receiver 1, or switching Kenyon Drake from a running back 1 to a flex player? And to me, the bigger gain is in the best value roster. So moving on from that, Marvin Jones is the 5th round selection. So our group of wide receivers obviously takes a hit with Marvin Jones and Josh Gordon as the pass catchers. And then in the 6th round, still going to Tavon Coleman. In the 7th round, still Kirk Cousins. 8th round, still Jordan Reed. And then the remaining guys is still the same. So a little bit tough here to, I would say, truly evaluate these guys. But I would say that this is the closest pair of rosters so far that we've looked at. Maybe something like a C to C minus, C plus comparison as far as the overall grades are concerned. But now let's transition to our last example and look, which I think is the most interesting actually, at a 12-team standard format with the 9th pick overall. As we look at this final example with the 9th pick in a standard format, the reason I said I was the most excited for it is because I think we put together a very strong roster. And let's just deep dive it immediately, because our first selection with the 9th pick was DeAndre Hopkins, and I thought that was very valuable. Very surprising that Antonio Brown went 7th overall. That's a shock. If you can get Antonio Brown 7th overall, that's a win no matter what format. But let's focus on our team specifically, because the real value here is landing DeAndre Hopkins and Odell Beckham both as our group of wide receivers is immediately tremendous. You could obviously say the same for the Antonio Brown and Michael Thomas combination that you see as well, but let's focus, like I said, on our roster. With the 3rd pick, we go T.Y. Hilton, and in the 4th round, again, we make that switch to the running back sooner. We go with Darius Geis. 5th round, Greg Olsen. 6th round, Ronald Jones. Then Aaron Jones. Then Jimmy Garoppolo, Jamal Williams to round off the bunch. And now, as always, the more interesting part to me, looking at the best value versus the zero running back strategy rosters, because in the first zero running back strategy, I would say so far, this is probably the highest graded, roster with a zero running back strategy. Obviously, I think you could say that's because the way that this broke, you're not always going to be able to land DeAndre Hopkins and Odell Beckham as your first 2 selections. In fact, I would say it's going to be harder than anything, but that's how things broke, and that's how we're rolling with this. And because of that specific scenario, I actually kept my first 2 selections the exact same, which I normally wouldn't do in a best value scenario. But since this was standard, I thought that this group of guys presented the biggest touchdown potential. I like DeAndre Hopkins. I could have gone Dalvin Cook, for example, or Melvin Gordon, but I stuck with my guys, DeAndre Hopkins, then Odell Beckham in the 2nd round, since Dalvin Cook, Gordon, Fournette were all gone. And in the 3rd round is where you see the first difference, because instead of T.Y. Hilton, I go with Jay Ajayi as my first running back. And then the 4th round, still go with Darius Geis, except now he's a running back 2 instead of having to carry the load as a running back 1. In the 5th round, I really like the value of a Greg Olsen. And then in the 6th round, Marvin Jones is my flex player. So the main differences here are swapping Ronald Jones and T.Y. Hilton for Marvin Jones and Jay Ajayi, which I think clearly Jay Ajayi and Jones are the better combination. So for that reason, I think the best value roster on the right is, better. compared to the zero running back strategy. It's more balanced, and for that reason, I'd probably give that roster, a B, maybe a B plus, you could even say. And the remaining picks were pretty much the same. So with that being said, let's talk the overall takeaway of all of this and whether the final recommendation is to go ahead and employ the zero running back strategy and at what point in the draft. Now, let's talk big picture after looking at these results and evaluate whether the zero running back strategy is a valid one or not. And I want to start with the positional picking specifically, because I think it was very easy to see that the rosters that I was able to put together in the latter part of the first round after picking 4th versus 9th overall, the better results were at the 9th pick overall. And the reason for that, I would say, is because we focus on what happened most recently. And in 2017, that included some big name wide receivers have down years, including an Odell Beckham, including an AJ Green, including a Julio Jones. And that allows us this year specifically to go ahead and load up on those guys if we want to. You saw it. There was a roster where I had DeAndre Hopkins and Odell Beckham both. And I didn't need to go back-to-back picks, last pick in the first round, first in the second round to land those guys. I actually had, 6 picks in between and still landed those guys, which I think is very impressive. And whether you want to use the strategy or not is something to keep your mind on, keep a mind on for this year. But now let's look at the transition. And what I mean by that is when we go from wide receiver selections to running back selections, because again, I think it was very easy to see that the earlier we make that transition, the more balanced and better roster we get overall. Because in some scenarios, I made my first running back selection in the 4th round, in others in the 5th round. Obviously, there's a big talent drop-off from the 4th and 5th round, and in every single round where you look at that. But if you make that first running back selection in the 4th round, you can salvage the situation a little bit easier than you can in the 5th round. And the next thing that I want to talk about is this strategy as a whole, and being 100% committed to the strategy or any other strategy as a matter of fact, because in any scenario, we don't know what's going to happen. Even in that scenario where I landed DeAndre Hopkins and Odell Beckham, more often than not, that won't be the case because we can't predict what's going to happen before us, what will happen before us. People will reach, people will take players that you want right before you, and you're going to have to adjust on the fly. That's why I don't like committing myself 100% to a single strategy. Sometimes you're going to have to reach, sometimes you're going to have to, just make adjustments. And for that reason, I would discourage anyone on going 100% committed to the zero running back strategy. Now, do I think it's a strategy that can work? I would say partially, because in that last roster that we saw, I think if you go wide receivers in the first 2 rounds, you can still put together a good roster. And speaking of that last example, I want to touch on the difference in formats, PPR versus standard. I would say the zero running back strategy is a little bit more valuable in standard leagues. The reason that I say that is because landing 2 big name wide receivers, especially towards the end of the 2nd round, or the end of the 1st and start of the 2nd round, that have high touchdown potential instead of reaching on a guy like a Christian McCaffrey or a Devontae Freeman, not only gives you, 2 stud pass catchers, but also gives good value. And I would say if you're going to go the zero running back strategy, go at it about 50%. So make that transition not after the 3rd round, but after the 2nd round, because I think that can be a huge difference. So not only could you go possibly like we saw an example, DeAndre Hopkins, Odell Beckham, then Darius Geis or Jay Ajayi, but if you made a selection with Antonio Brown maybe in the 4th or 5th pick, and then somehow had an AJ Green fall to you, and then in the 3rd round a Joe Mixon was available or a Jerick McKinnon, that's absolutely sensational. And that was precipitated from partially following the zero running back strategy. So in conclusion, my takeaway is this: with the zero running back strategy, it is a risky one because running backs no doubt have more value, especially high caliber running backs than high caliber wide receivers because the value they have as pass catchers as well and as touchdown vultures in the red zone. So just keep that in mind. My philosophy is always, at least with 2 out of your 3 picks, have 2 of those selections be running back. Obviously there's some scenarios, even this video itself included a scenario where that wasn't the case, but let me know what you think, because overall I would say with a 0 running back strategy this year, try and stay away from it, or definitely go ahead and adjust it, because it needs adjustment, and it would be somewhat of a, you know, half 0 running back, half 0 wide receiver strategy is what I would call it. And let me hear it in the comments section. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What did you think of, you know, the 0 running back strategy rosters that I put together versus the best value rosters that I put together with the players overall? Let me hear it. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and I will see you guys in future videos.